Hey guys, tonight we're taking a trip back to a simpler time. No smartphones, no streaming, no overpriced lattes, just the sweet scent of burning flesh, the distant clank of chains, and a crowd cheering because someone's about to get absolutely obliterated in front of their kids. That's right. Before Netflix, HBO, or even flipbooks, humanity's favorite group activity was watching another human being die in the messiest, most theatrical way possible. Bonus points if it was someone you didn't like. So, dim the lights, light a candle for the mood, or for plague prevention. We don't judge. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Public execution. History's favorite entertainment. Chapter 1. Heads Up. Beheadings and the Art of the Perfect Slice. Long before YouTube tutorials on knife skills, humans were perfecting the art of cutting heads off in front of a live studio audience. Beheading wasn't just a form of capital punishment. It was the capital punishment. Quick, theatrical, easy to clean up with a good drainage system and a willing stable boy. It was the aristocratic death of choice. Want to keep your dignity, lose your head in style. Nothing screamed nobility quite like kneeling on velvet cushions while a masked guy with forearms like cured ham swung a blade the size of a canoe paddle at your neck. This wasn't just execution. It was a farewell performance. You'd bow to the crowd, deliver a snappy last line, maybe pray a little or a lot, and then thwack, curtain call. Unless, of course, things went horribly wrong, which they often did. See, beheading had one job: be fast, efficient, merciful, even, if you're the sort of person who uses that word in the same sentence as splitting someone open like a ripe melon. But history has a rich track record of executioners who either skipped arm day or got stage fright. Swing and a miss? That's one. Miss again? Oops. Hit the shoulder. Third swing's the charm. By the fourth attempt, everyone's rethinking whether this guy should be in charge of public safety scissors, let alone axes. Let's talk tools. The axe was the original favorite. Heavy, brutal, and completely unforgiving. No finesse here. You weren't aiming for surgical precision. You were trying to separate soul from body using brute gravity and hope. The French and Scots loved axes. The English dabbled too. The axe gave us some of history's most awkward farewell moments, like when Mary, Queen of Scots, needed multiple chops because the executioner had butterfingers and a nervous tic. Fun fact, her little dog hid under her skirts the whole time. Surprise! If axes were the medieval equivalent of a sledgehammer, the sword was the rapier wit of the execution world. Sharper, cleaner, and generally wielded by someone with slightly more upper body control. Swords were usually reserved for the nobility. Regular folks? You got the axe. But if you had a title, land, or the good luck of being someone's bastard uncle with a bit of political intrigue behind you, you could request the sword. Executioners had reputations, and like baristas or barbers, you wanted a good one. Some were local celebrities. Townspeople would gossip, "Oh, he's the one who got Sir Thomas with one clean stroke. A real artist, that one." Others, not so much. Imagine being known as the guy who turned executions into endurance events. That poor soul died 3 times before his head came off. In some towns you could request your executioner, the way modern folks request surgeons or wedding DJs. You'd hear things like, "Don't give me Gerald." He hesitates, "I want Lars." He brings his own whetstone. Let's not forget the prep. The condemned were expected to behave with a bit of class. No running, no screaming, no flailing about. You walked out, gave a wave, maybe a tearful speech, and then positioned your head just right. There were customs. Pillows, blocks, even special shirts made with a handy neck hole for easier placement. Think of it as execution chic, minimalist with a splash of fatalism. Now, there was often a priest. Priests loved executions. It was their version of a halftime show. They'd bless the condemned, pray aloud, sometimes even offer to hold hands. Some condemned folks kissed the priest's ring. Others just said, "You first," and gave him the finger. The crowd? Oh, the crowd was everything. They came early, brought snacks, sat on shoulders, kids on leashes. This wasn't some solemn, quiet affair. This was a social event, a civic gathering, a shared moment of bloodlust wrapped in civic righteousness. Bets were placed. Cheers erupted. Vendors sold sausages shaped like heads. You could buy commemorative woodcuts. I was there when Lord Rutherford popped like a cork. And people talked about good beheadings. They remembered them. Years later, someone would say, "Remember the Easter one with the tax guy?" One stroke, like slicing butter. It was performance art, violence with a touch of showbiz. Of course, not all executions went as planned. Sometimes the axe would miss. Sometimes the sword bounced. Sometimes the condemned wouldn't sit still. Or the block slipped. Or the executioner got drunk. Or the crowd surged forward and trampled the stage. Humans are messy. Executioners, more so. There's the case of James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, 1685. His executioner panicked and took 5 swings to remove the head. Eventually, he had to use a knife to finish the job. Witnesses fainted. Some cheered anyway. The priest vomited. A strong review. Then there's Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, age 67, accused of treason by Henry VIII. She refused to kneel. The executioner chased her around the scaffold, swinging wildly like a confused lumberjack. By the end, she was more diced than decapitated. The lesson? Never mess with a 67-year-old noblewoman in a bad mood. And let us not forget the French Revolution. The guillotine. Oh, the guillotine. The rock star of execution devices. Clean, efficient, marketable. People sold tickets. Parisian ladies brought opera glasses. It was lightning fast and oddly elegant. Heads tumbled neatly into baskets. No mess. Just a satisfying thump and maybe a wink from the severed head if you were lucky. Doctors debated whether heads stayed conscious for a few seconds. One scientist even claimed he saw blinking. Another tried talking to the head of a friend. The head did not reply, either due to death or disinterest. But the real thrill was the crowd. Execution days became unofficial holidays. People skipped work. Artists painted. Poets rhymed. Bakers sold head-shaped pies. Children played executioner and traitor behind haystacks. There were parades, bands, speeches. A man once proposed to his girlfriend just before the blade dropped. Nothing says love like watching the upper class get chopped. And the executioners? Oh, they got fan mail. Women sent love letters. Some married executioners. Others just sent gifts. Wine, perfume, notes that said things like, "I love a man who finishes what he starts." Let's not romanticize too much. This was horror. But it was a horror people craved. It gave structure, justice, closure. It let the poor see the mighty fall. It let the angry cheer while someone else suffered. And for a brief moment, it made everyone feel something together. So, next time you complain about reruns on TV, just remember, 500 years ago, your great-great-great-something was sitting in a muddy field, eating an onion, and watching someone's neck become a necklace X-neck. Family fun, civic justice, and a real lesson in anatomy. Beheadings, fast, loud, occasionally accurate, and always unforgettable. History's sharpest form of closure. Chapter 2. Burn, Baby, Burn, when fire was the drama queen. If beheadings were a sharp, elegant slice of justice, burnings were pure, theatrical overkill. The fire wasn't just a tool, it was the star of the show. Beheadings whispered, "You've been found guilty." Burnings screamed, "We need a showstopper and some screaming that carries for miles." Public burnings weren't about subtlety, they were about spectacle, big, flashy, slow. A drawn-out reminder that disobedience doesn't just get punished, it gets flambéed. It was horror meets pageantry, a bonfire of sin, guilt, and sometimes poor record-keeping. Let's start with the basics. Fire in history has always been more than just heat. It's been religious, symbolic, dramatic. Burning someone wasn't just execution, it was purification, cleansing by flame, a cosmic bleach job. The soul was supposedly being purified as the flesh became crispy pork rinds. Nothing says spiritual renewal like second-degree burns. And the logistics? Oh, there was prep. Days of preparation. You didn't just light someone up like a barbecue on a whim. You built a stage, a raised platform, a proper wood pile, dry kindling, big logs, and just the right airflow for maximum roastage. A team of assistants hauled the wood, someone fetched the pitch, and of course the executioner practiced his dramatic torchlighting moment. You had to get the angles right. The condemned? Well, they were often carted in by wagon, tied to a post, sometimes gagged, often barefoot. If you were lucky, they added a bag of gunpowder tied to your neck for a nice little pop to speed things up. If not, you got to cook slowly, like a forgotten casserole. The crowd came early, always. They wanted the front row, the good spot. Families arrived with baskets. Vendors circled like crows. Children got piggyback rides to see better. And what were they watching? A person. Maybe a heretic, maybe a witch, maybe just being slow-roasted into a moral lesson with smoke effects. Witches, in particular, got the fire special. Medieval Europe had a fire fetish when it came to suspected witches. Accused of consorting with the devil, fire. Talked back to a priest, fire. Owned too many cats, fire. And let's be honest, half the accusations were more about local gossip and missing goats than anything else. But that didn't stop the ritual. There'd be a trial, or at least something trial-shaped. The outcome was predetermined. It was less about justice and more about theatrics with robes. The condemned might get to say a few last words, or be silenced entirely. A bishop would step forward and declare the sentence. The crowd would murmur, then cheer. Executioners would tie the person to the stake, sometimes with ropes, sometimes chains, and the fire would be lit from underneath. It was the historical equivalent of dramatic lighting from a horror movie. Now let's talk timeline. Burnings were slow. That's kind of the point. If you were lucky, the smoke got you first. Inhalation, unconsciousness, asphyxiation, done. But if the fire was poorly built or the wind uncooperative, well, your legs cooked first, then your arms, then your chest. It was like being peeled alive, one blister at a time. People screamed, and the crowd listened. Some wept, some clapped, some sold buns. Inquisitions loved fire. Spain practically turned it into a cottage industry. Heretics were burned as a message. Don't deviate, don't question, and for heaven's sake, don't translate the Bible without permission. The auto da fe, or act of faith, was a religious ceremony that ended with barbecue. Chanting, banners, music, and then the condemned lined up like meat skewers. Sometimes multiple people burned together. The fire had to be wide or carefully timed to catch in sequence. One after another, they went up in a crackling wave of screams, hymns, and rising smoke. The church often emphasized that this wasn't vengeance. It was mercy. The fire saved their souls. The crowd came for the lesson and stayed for the fireworks. Now, let's go north to Scotland. They like their witches extra crispy. You could be accused of weather manipulation, sheep-related sorcery, or giving someone a funny look after Mass. Trial? Questionable. Evidence? Thin? Hysteria? Absolutely. One famous case. Janet Horne, the last person legally burned as a witch in Britain, in 1727. Her crime? Having a deformed hand and walking barefoot in the fog. Executed in front of her village. Her daughter, also accused, escaped. The town later felt bad about it. A little. They erected a plaque. Way after the fact. And then there was Joan of Arc. National hero. Religious visionary. Teenage girl with a sword and opinions. She got fire, courtesy of the English, who weren't fond of charismatic young Frenchwomen leading armies. They burned her at age 19, once to kill her. Then again, just to be sure. And a third time because apparently the ashes needed punishment too. Even in the Americas, fire played a role. In early colonial Salem, witches weren't burned, they were hanged. But that didn't stop European traditions from arriving later. Fires were mobile. Execution by flame traveled well. And while burnings were often religious, they were just as often political. Fire was a great way to erase someone. No body to bury, no martyr's relics to distribute. Just ashes, smoke, and a charred post. It was erasure with extra flair. But wait, there's more. Sometimes the fire didn't work. Wet wood, poor kindling. Executioners who were new on the job. That led to reignitions. The condemned half-burned, doused, and lit again. The crowd, they'd boo. Booing an execution was a thing. You could go viral for a bad fire. In some towns, local laws required that a fire be seen from a certain distance, not for justice, for visibility. You wanted people across the valley to know someone got flambéed for stealing from the church pantry. Executioners had techniques: the torch triangle, the log pyramid, the two-flame slow roast. They argued about airflow, char angles, heat retention. It was a science and a stage show, and sometimes a disaster. Fire also became a holiday feature. Special burnings happened on saint days. Execution calendars were tied to feast days. Come for St. Bartholomew's, see the martyrs burn, stay for the dancing goats. And don't forget the props. Some burnings had costumes, the condemned dressed in heretic robes or painted signs around their necks. Enemy of Christ, lover of Satan. Literally just French. As the fire burned, people prayed, cried, or tossed things into the flame, notes, confessions, bits of parchment. It was part ritual, part entertainment, part interactive drama. And like any big event, it had merchandise. Trinkets made from burnt wood, charcoal drawings, bread shaped like steaks. I survived the heretic roast. Shirts, if they existed, would have sold out. When the fire died down and the ashes cooled, children poked the remains with sticks. Dogs sniffed the coals, and townsfolk nodded grimly. Justice, they said, order, peace. Then they went home, where someone probably had soup cooking over the same kind of fire. So next time you roast marshmallows, light a candle, or complain about the heat, remember, once upon a time the fire didn't just warm you, it judged you. And if you were unlucky enough to be born with the wrong face, wrong faith, or too many freckles, well, you got to meet the drama queen up close. And she always brought the heat. Chapter 3. Drawn, Quartered, and Audience Participation. If public beheadings were the clean cut and burnings were the slow roast, then being drawn and quartered was the medieval equivalent of pulling apart a roast chicken in front of a screaming audience. Except the chicken was still alive. And screaming too. Drawn and quartered wasn't just execution. It was a genre. A grotesque anatomical breakdown of a person in 4 acts, each more ridiculous than the last. It was violence as public theater, punishment as nightmare logic, and crowd engagement on an interactive level. Let's start with the title. Drawn doesn't mean sketched like a tragic cartoon. It means dragged, literally hauled through the streets by horse, cart, or, if you were very unlucky, on your back tied to a door or hurdle. This was pre-show humiliation. You were paraded through mud, excrement, and festive jeering crowds all the way to the execution site. If you weren't dead from the potholes and horse hooves, you were emotionally shredded by the time you arrived. Then came the quartered part. This was not done with mathematical elegance. It did not involve a ruler or a grid. It involved ropes, horses, knives, and a creative disregard for human anatomy. The goal was to tear the body into 4 mostly recognizable pieces: legs, arms, and whatever was left in between. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, you were hanged, but not all the way. You were hung until nearly dead, enough to choke, dangle, and lose bowel control, but not enough to die. Death was for quitters. The real show was still to come. Then you were cut down, trembling and gasping, and the real artistry began. You were disemboweled, not metaphorically. Your guts were pulled out, sometimes while you were still conscious. Some were burned in front of you, which was less a spiritual warning and more a look at your pancreas Steve moment. Your genitals, also removed, because nothing says justice like turning someone into a eunuch seconds before they bleed to death. And if you made it to this point conscious, congratulations. You're part of an elite club no one wants to be in. Then came the quartering. Ropes were tied to your limbs, 2 arms, 2 legs, and horses were encouraged to walk in opposite directions. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the horses weren't strong enough, and the executioner had to step in with a blade, like a butcher giving up on tug-of-war. The resulting pieces were then displayed around the kingdom. Heads on spikes, limbs on city gates, torsos on walls. It was the medieval version of a press release. This is what happens when you commit treason. Also, mind the smell. But here's the fun part. People watched this. They packed into the square. They brought their kids. Vendors sold pies and warm ale. The smell of roasted meat from nearby stalls mingled with the scent of actual human suffering. Everyone had their favorite part. Some liked the dragging. Others the hanging. Hardcore fans waited for the intestines. You know, real connoisseurs. And don't think the crowd was passive. They booed, they heckled, they shouted advice. Go for the legs first. Sometimes they threw things, cabbage, rotten eggs, small animals. It was public blood sport with Yelp reviews shouted live. Executioners had their own fan base. The good ones were fast, strong, merciless. The bad ones? A whole different kind of entertainment. Fumbled rope work, horses that wandered off, guts that slipped through fingers like spaghetti. Slapstick meets carnage. They even had rivalries. Oh, you like Roger from Kent? Please. Edwin from York once got a guy quartered before the torch singer hit the high note. Apprentices studied under senior executioners. It was a trade. Hold the entrails like this. Use a thicker blade for peasants. Nobles, you'll want the ceremonial dagger. It was bloody mentorship. Sometimes there were warm-ups, other executions before the main event, like opening acts, pickpockets hanged, thieves flogged. Then came the headliner. One guy, 4 limbs, and the slowest tug-of-war match you've ever seen. The condemned sometimes got the last word. They'd make long speeches, bless the king, curse the court, or just sob until their voice cracked. Every now and then someone cracked a joke, hoping to go down in history as a witty corpse. Most just prayed. Some towns turned these executions into civic pride. We had 3 quarterings last spring. Great turnout. Got my apron signed by the hangman. It was the closest thing to National Theater, and for those who couldn't make it, the remains traveled. Heads were dipped in tar to keep them fresh for display. Limbs were nailed up like grotesque public art. It wasn't just punishment, it was advertising. Rebellion? Here's an arm in Chester, a leg in York, the head? Tower Bridge, of course. And yes, Tower Bridge had a rotating head display. The London skyline was a gallery of faces with the worst Yelp scores imaginable. Birds perched on them. Rats scurried underneath. Some heads stayed up so long they were bleached bone before someone remembered to take them down. Sometimes families tried to collect what was left. That's definitely Uncle Greg's femur. Tourists, yes, medieval tourists, wrote about the gore in letters. Dearest Margaret, today I saw a man burst like a sack of sausages. The kids adored it. Drawn and quartered wasn't just execution. It was a message. A full-body warning label with extra limbs. It said, "We don't just kill traitors. We turn them into puzzles." And the crowds loved it. Because for one moment, they weren't the ones on the rope. They could laugh, eat, shiver, and gasp while someone else took the fall. In an unfair world, justice was rarely just. But it was loud, and messy, and shared. So the next time you feel embarrassed tripping on a sidewalk, remember, some guy once got dragged by a horse through a street of feces, nearly hanged, partially disemboweled, and split like a wishbone in front of 400 people while a vendor sold meat pies nearby. And you think your Monday was rough. Chapter 4. Gallows Humor. Hanging out with friends. If being drawn and quartered was the medieval full-course meal of executions, hanging was more like the lunch special. It was affordable, easy to stage, didn't require fire permits or horses, and best of all, people loved it. Hanging was history's most reliable death machine, and the gallows? That was the people's stage. Let's start with the basic setup. You've got a wooden frame, some rope, a drop, and an eager crowd. That's all you really need for a public hanging. Add a condemned person with trembling legs and a priest muttering last rites, and you've got yourself a full-on civic event. Hanging was versatile. It worked for thieves, traitors, highwaymen, witches, before they graduated to fire, deserters, pirates, and occasionally someone who just annoyed the wrong noble. If you were condemned to hang, chances are you weren't fancy enough for a sword and didn't warrant the cost of firewood. Hanging was execution for the masses. There were different methods. The short drop, for instance, which was a polite way of saying, "We're just going to strangle you slowly for 20 minutes while your legs do the medieval Macarena." It was long, twitchy, and deeply unpleasant to watch. Perfect for audiences with time to kill. Then came the long drop. Introduced with the exciting idea of mercy, it measured the rope so your neck snapped instantly. In theory. In practice, sometimes the drop was too short. Sometimes it was too long. There are recorded cases of heads popping clean off, which is not great for dignity but excellent for crowd reaction. And what a crowd it was. Hanging days were unofficial holidays. Businesses closed, people skipped work. Children got dressed up. You brought the whole family. Think of it like a picnic with extra choking. The condemned might give a speech. Some repented, sobbing into the priest's sleeve. Others yelled at the authorities. A few went full stand-up comic. One man cracked jokes about his mother-in-law on the scaffold and got applause. If your last words were good enough, they might be written down. If they were bad, well, history is quiet on those. Vendors loved hangings. They sold everything from meat pies to commemorative handkerchiefs. One London execution in the 18th century had so many food stalls, it looked like a grim medieval county fair. You could buy roasted nuts while a pirate swung in the breeze. And there were souvenirs. Bits of rope were highly prized. People believed hanging rope held power. It could cure ailments, boost fertility, or protect against lightning. Which is a big ask from a piece of cord that just choked a guy named Edgar. The executioners? Local legends. Some were loved, others loathed. Most were drunk. It was a stressful job, and nothing says professionalism like swaying on your feet while adjusting a noose. Sometimes they miscalculated. Too short a rope and the condemned danced for a while. Too long and pop. Then there was the trapdoor malfunction, which led to awkward shuffling while someone fetched a ladder. One executioner in Scotland once forgot the rope. Forgot it. Had to send someone to fetch it while the crowd waited awkwardly. It was the Renaissance equivalent of technical difficulties. And sometimes the gallows themselves broke. Too many people hanged at once. Poor carpentry, wet weather. Result, an execution collapse and a crowd with a story to tell for generations. In some towns, gallows were permanent fixtures, a warning sign and local landmark in one. Meet me by the gibbet past the bakery. In others, they were wheeled out for the occasion like a macabre carnival ride. Repeat offenders? They got creative. Hanging in chains, meaning you were hanged, then left to rot in an iron cage. Birds picked at you. The wind swayed your skeleton. And tourists took notes. Then there was the hanging of animals. Yes, animals. Pigs, dogs, and even roosters were put on trial. If a pig ate a baby or a rooster crowed on a Sunday, they could be sentenced to death. Often by hanging, and yes, people showed up for that too. Some towns hanged people in batches, like a grim to-do list. Today's schedule: 3 thieves, 2 heretics, and 1 very unlucky barber. Crowd attendance was expected. It was your civic duty to witness someone else's punishment. But hanging wasn't always smooth. Sometimes the condemned survived. In rare cases, the rope broke and the crowd gasped. If the person lived long enough and public opinion turned, they might be pardoned. Divine intervention, they called it, also known as the rope snapped and the mob got sentimental. One man survived 3 separate hangings and was finally let go. He lived another decade, probably slept with one eye open the whole time. But for most, the end came with a snap, a twitch, and silence. The body swayed. The crowd cheered or murmured, and someone somewhere muttered, "Justice is served." Then they went home, or to the tavern, or to the next execution, because in the world of public punishments the gallows were always booked. Justice didn't rest, and neither did the audience. So the next time you're standing in line for concert tickets or watching a TikTok go viral, just remember. A few centuries ago, the trending event of the week was a man swinging from a rope while someone next to you sold hot cider and your kid asked if he could have the foot. Good times, great rope, and always a strong turnout. But hanging wasn't just about execution. It was also about location. Some gallows were built at crossroads, where everyone had to pass them on the way to market. Others loomed over harbors or sat proudly on hilltops, so even the passing ships could tip their hats to justice. There were gallows visible from miles away, casting long wooden shadows over the village, and longer psychological ones over anyone thinking of stealing a loaf of bread. Sometimes gallows got nicknames: the Old Lady, the Singing Tree, Justice Pole. Some had plaques, others had permanent ropes dangling like forgotten wind chimes. They became part of the town's charm, like a statue, but one that used to kick. And then there was the gossip. Oh, the gossip. Did you see the hangman trip? He nearly joined the condemned. Or, I heard the rope was sabotaged. The widow bribed the cooper. The scaffold was as much a social network as the local tavern. People argued over whether the drop was too quick or the priest too weepy. The executioner's hat became a topic of fashion discussion. For children, it was an education. They'd stand on tiptoes, mouths open, absorbing a full lesson in anatomy, law, and how not to steal sheep. Parents called it moral instruction. The kids just wanted to see someone do the kicky leg dance. Even love bloomed there. People met their future spouses at the gallows. We both reached for the same pie while watching a hanging. It was fate. Courtships began on execution days. Nothing says romance like locking eyes over the swinging corpse of a convicted swindler. And when it rained, the gallows still went on. Wet rope, soggy hoods, miserable priests muttering through their teeth. The condemned sometimes slipped on the steps, adding a bit of slapstick to the tragedy. But the crowd still stood there, soaked and loyal, clutching meat pies and umbrellas fashioned from goat hide. In short, hanging wasn't just a punishment. It was an experience, a town tradition, an afternoon with snacks and screams. It brought people together, it reinforced the law, and it gave local birds a reason to hang around. So, next time you complain about jury duty, remember, at least no one expects you to show up with your children in a bonnet to watch someone die while snacking on a plum tart. Hangings, easy to set up, hard to look away from, and always swinging with possibility. Chapter 5. The Blood Pit Economy, Vendors, Vultures, and Vibes. If you think executions were just about justice, think again. They were marketplaces with a splash of existential dread, part morality tale, part retail therapy. And for the savvy merchant, they were Black Friday with a corpse. Public executions weren't just about punishment. They were a booming economic microclimate, a one-day festival of fear, refreshments, and roaring capitalism. You might have come to see justice served, but you stayed for the meat pies, the miracle elixirs, and the impromptu juggling act featuring a guy who once stole 3 onions and now had 1 hour to live. Let's be clear, an execution day was good for business. Local vendors didn't just show up, they prepped for weeks. Sausages were strung, apples were candied, ale barrels were rolled into position like medieval kegs of anticipation. A really juicy beheading meant sales would double, especially if the condemned was famous. Bonus points if they were noble. Those crowds had coin. You had food stalls, trinket hawkers, bone charm dealers, and impromptu musicians all lining the route to the scaffold. Children darted through legs with sticky hands. Merchants yelled over each other like a haunted farmer's market. Hot tongue stew, still steaming. 2 for 1, witch pins, guaranteed unholy. Blessed rope scrap, only slightly cursed. And the commemorative goods, exquisite. Miniature gallows carved from cherry wood. Drawings of the condemned with extra dramatic eyebrows. Handkerchiefs printed with, "I was there, and so was his head." You could even buy biscuits shaped like feet. Macabre? Sure. Delicious? surprisingly. Then there were the miracle salesmen, the medieval version of pop-up brands. Drink this and your neck will never snap. Or, bathe in this and you'll pass the gallows unscathed. Did they work? Did people buy them anyway? Yes, especially after watching someone cough their soul out in real time. Relics from executions were big money. Dirt from beneath the scaffold? Sold. A nail from the gallows? Sold. A splinter from the hanging platform? That'll be 2 chickens and your dignity. If you were really lucky, you might bribe the executioner for a piece of rope. Supposedly, it cured gout. Spoiler, it didn't, but it made for great storytelling. Local inns cashed in too. They filled up the night before, charging extra for execution-facing rooms. The view of justice from the upstairs window, priceless. Tavern keepers ran themed menus, the heretic's roast, swing and ale, flamin' turnip surprise. Don't ask what was in it. You don't want to know. For the town itself, it was like hosting the Olympics of moral reckoning. Judges arrived, clergy paraded, peddlers set up booths overnight, civic pride swelled like a bloated corpse. The mayor got to wave, the priest got to moralize, the butcher sold out. Even children got in on the economic action. They carved little hanging figures from wax. They sold sinner sticks, basically random twigs blessed by nobody. One kid made a fortune painting faces on pebbles and calling them executioner's tears. It was performance art, and nobody questioned the branding. But it wasn't just humans cashing in. Animals showed up. Dogs sniffed at dropped pie crusts. Crows took up real estate on the scaffold beams, waiting for leftovers. Execution days were like a medieval buffet with a side of death. And then there were the gamblers. Oh yes. Bets were placed on everything. How long the hanging would take. How many screams. Whether the head would bounce, whether the priest would cry, whether the condemned would vomit. You could walk away with a week's wages, or lose your goat because the guy's neck did snap clean. High risk, high reward, high nonsense. Of course, some people came just for the vibes. They didn't care who was dying or why. They liked the buzz, the music, the smell of spiced cider, the weird energy of watching collective punishment dressed up as civic theater. Execution day was community day, a shared narrative, a group scream. It was where you saw your neighbors, bartered bread, got cursed by a crone, and maybe watched your ex's cousin get flung off a scaffold. A town square, but with body parts. So, if you ever think capitalism is a modern invention, just remember. Somewhere in the 14th century Europe, a man with a cart full of meat pies and a pigeon feather hat made a fortune shouting, "Hot guts and justice, 2 for a penny," while a crowd of 700 cheered as someone's final breath fogged up history. And that, my friends, is the blood pit economy, all sales final. But not everyone approved. There were always the pearl clutchers, the somber moralists who'd complain that the whole event had gotten too commercial. In my day, you went to an execution for the sermon, not the cinnamon bread. Others moaned that it was losing its educational value. The youth just come for the snacks, they'd cry, while chewing on sugared almonds themselves. Still, the momentum was unstoppable. The blood pit economy fed the town's purse. It paid for roads, bridges, even the occasional school, though you had to walk past a dismembered leg nailed to a gate to get there. The town's identity grew around its scaffold, a place known not for its harvest or craftsmanship, but for its efficiency in killing people and selling snacks. Some enterprising towns even advertised their execution calendar to draw tourists. Come see the triple hanging next Sunday. Fresh bread, new gallows, same great screams. People packed wagons for miles around. Regional rivalries flared. "Oh, your town only does rope. Ours has fire and juggling." It became execution tourism, and it boomed. Even after the event, the economy lingered. The site turned into a hangout. People visited to feel the history. Lovers carved initials into the scaffold legs. Teens dared each other to touch the spot where the blood had pooled. The place became hallowed in the most bizarre way, a shrine to justice, fear, and unusually good pastries. Chapter 6. The Executioner's Playlist, a Greatest Hits. Compilation. Every show needs a star, and in the world of public execution, that star was the executioner, a man with a hood, a blade, and a resume soaked in blood and job security. He wasn't just there to swing the axe or tie the knot. No. He was the conductor of the symphony of screams, the curator of closure, the one man who could end your life and your character arc in under 5 minutes. Executioners weren't just workers, they were artists, specialists, mythic figures you feared, respected, and occasionally bribed. Let's talk career path. Executioner wasn't a job you applied for. It usually ran in the family, passed down like a cursed heirloom. "Dad, do I have to cleave heretics today?" "Yes, son, and mind your footing. We don't want another giblet slip like last week." Once you were in, though, you had perks. Exemption from taxes. A special house, usually on the edge of town for obvious reasons. Access to cool outfits, leather aprons, blood-proof boots, and hoods that screamed, "Don't talk to me unless you want a rough Tuesday." But being an executioner was lonely work. People avoided you in public. Children whispered about you. Bakers overcharged you. Dating was complicated. What do you do? "I separate heads from bodies." "Oh, check, please." Still, you had fans, especially if you were good. A swift cut, a clean drop, a head that landed face up, that got you applause. You were reviewed like a restaurant. Gerald did the hanging. Solid form, bit of flair, no mess. And flair mattered. Some executioners developed signatures, a little spin before the axe, a double knot flourish on the noose. One guy did a hat tip every time he snapped a spine. Legends. Some kept souvenirs. Not officially, but, well, let's just say more than a few had a drawer of teeth or a jar labeled notable ears. History is vague, but suspiciously vague. And then there was the playlist. Not music, no, methods. Executioners had a full lineup of techniques depending on the crime, the budget, and how theatrical the crowd wanted their Tuesday. The clean chop, classic. One swing, head gone, crowd gasps. Easy to botch if your axe was dull or your hands were shaking from too much medieval moonshine. The long drop, perfected over time. Rope length measured to snap the neck. Too short, and it's a wiggle fest. Too long and, well, let's just say, the audience gets a splash zone. The fire starter, for heretics and witches. Involved choreography, stage setup, and flint skills. One guy practiced his torchlighting moves in front of a mirror. True story. The drawn drama for traitors. Started with dragging, ended in disassembly. Needed assistance, and a strong stomach. The spectacle swerve, rare, but memorable. Sometimes included reading of poetry, dramatic sword flips, or calling out your own name before swinging, for the executioner who was also a bit of a thespian. Executioners kept records. Some had little black books, names, crimes, notes like "cried a lot" or "head bounced." They studied their craft, compared techniques at annual guild meetings. Yes, there were executioner guilds, they had badges, and probably a very awkward annual dinner. There were legends, too. The executioner who could behead blindfolded, the one who sharpened his blade on the condemned's final confession, The man who executed twins in under 30 seconds and caught both heads before they hit the ground. Unconfirmed, but whispered across taverns, and if you were really, really good, you became famous. Your name whispered in cities far from your scaffold. He got 3 heads in one morning, like chopping cabbage. Parents told their kids, "Eat your stew or I'll send for Magnus the Merciless." Some executioners had fans. Women wrote love letters. One famously received a bouquet before a hanging with a note that read, "You make death look graceful." Another was rumored to have signed autographs in blood. Possibly not his. But no star shines forever. Some executioners aged badly, missed the swing, tied the wrong knot, took too long and got booed. The crowd turned. Retirements were not graceful. Usually someone younger, quicker, with more dramatic flair took your place. And execution wasn't always a sure thing. Sometimes politics changed. The public soured, a king fell. A new regime swept in and said, "Actually, that guy you killed last week was a patriot." Oops. Some executioners were executed themselves, either for botching the job, angering the wrong noble, or simply being a grim reminder of the previous reign. They knew too much, or simply had too much rope, but others retired, quietly, moved to the countryside, grew turnips, and when a neighbor asked about the strange metal hook over the fireplace, they just said, "Old tool, farming stuff." Still, for a while, they were the gods of death, the hammer behind the law, the last face you saw before nothing. So, here's to the executioners. Grim, misunderstood, occasionally dramatic. Part butcher, part stagehand, part therapist with a very short session length. And every time a sword was sharpened or a noose prepared, somewhere in the distance you could hear them mutter, "Let's make this one a showstopper." Chapter 7. Family Fun Day with Extra Screams and Blood Confetti. There's something profoundly absurd about watching children kick a leather ball around while a heretic burns 20 yards away, but that was exactly the vibe. Execution Day was a contradiction wrapped in picnic cloth. Horror and holiday hand in hand. You could buy a sweet, pat your child's head, and then cheer as a man's legs twitched one last time. If you're imagining a quiet, reverent crowd gathered to solemnly witness the administration of justice, you've read the wrong fairy tale. Public executions were the Renaissance version of family movie night. Except the popcorn was stale bread, the feature presentation was live and screaming. And the blood? Oh, it sprayed. Because what better way to bond with your loved ones than over a public display of dismemberment? Execution Day was not only Community Day, it was a field trip. Schools closed, churches postponed services. And if you didn't show up, people assumed you were either sick or suspicious. Old Martin didn't come to the hanging? What's he hiding? Parents packed baskets, bread, cheese, maybe some apples if the market had been kind, and marched the kids out to the scaffold hill. Toddlers on shoulders, grannies on benches, dogs trailing behind with hopeful eyes, and absolutely no understanding of what was happening, except that the meat smell might eventually be real. Children loved it. They didn't know why, but they did. It wasn't just the noise or the crowd, it was the drama, the pageantry, the random chance of seeing someone pee themselves before death. That was peak entertainment. They played games nearby. Hangman, of course, but with real-time references. Stick gallows built in the dirt. Dolls made from rags and imagination. Only today they were stand-ins for Mr. Everett the tax collector, who was getting the chop for embezzling from the bishop. Vendors sold sweets shaped like skulls, little pies with red jam oozing out the top, and justice sticks, basically bread on a stick. There were masks, ribbons, trinkets, and once, in one deeply creative town, collectible cards with illustrated executions. Swap you a hanging herald for a flaming Beatrice. Parents used the moment for moral teaching. See that man with the noose? He stole 2 chickens and refused to tithe. Let this be a lesson. Which, to the children, translated as stealing equals neck pain. Noted. Teenagers flirted on the outer edges of the crowd. Girls in bonnets whispered about whether the executioner was hot under the hood. Spoiler, often no. Boys tried to sneak closer to see the splash zone. Bets were made. 10 pence says he screams like a goat. No way, that guy's a stoic. Silent drop. Couples made memories. Remember when we first saw a traitor's head fall together? Of course, love. You spilled cider on my boots. Some even got married after. It was symbolic. New beginnings following a very definitive end. Picnics were laid out near the gallows like red and white checkered front row seats to carnage. The scent of roast onions mingled with sweat and adrenaline. People sang songs. They composed limericks. One enterprising lute player made a decent living composing personalized gallows jingles for those about to go. Johnny stole a cow, and now he swings. Come hear the bell of justice ring. And yes, it was dangerous. Occasionally, a rope snapped, a fire spread too far, or a poorly aimed axe flung something into the third row. But hey, danger builds character. Plus, it gave people something to gossip about until the next hanging. By evening, the crowds drifted home. Kids dragged their feet, still buzzing from sugar and spectacle. Parents shook their heads. Shame about that guy's ankle. Should have worn better shoes. And Grandma tucked her souvenir noose charm into her apron, whispering, "We got a good one today." Because when you lived in a world of hard winters, bad bread, and even worse dentistry, public executions weren't just entertainment. They were relief. A brief break from the grind. A ritual of blood and bonding. A splash of red on the gray canvas of life. So, the next time you complain about taking the family to the movies, just remember, in the good old days, all it took was a rope, a post, and a bit of imagination to create memories that would last a lifetime. Or at least, until someone else got sentenced. Some towns leaned into it even harder. The execution site became a semi-permanent fairground. One French village built bleachers, another held a best picnic setup contest. A German town once let the condemned choose the music. Spoiler, it was lute-heavy and awkward. Seasoned attendees brought cushions. First-timers brought wide eyes and poorly timed questions. "Daddy, why is he purple now?" Because that's what guilt looks like, sweetie. Religious leaders often gave pre-execution sermons. These were long, theatrical, and rarely subtle. This man, like the devil, wore mismatched socks and never paid his taxes. The condemned sat nearby, looking increasingly nervous while trying to remember if his socks matched. And then there was the after-party. Some people went straight to the tavern to reenact the highlights using spoons and crusty bread. Others went home and added a new notch to the family storybook. That was the day baby Clara got her first tooth and also saw her first disembowelment. Because in a world full of plague, famine, and general doom, a well-executed execution, pun absolutely intended, was a rare certainty. A story you could share, a memory that stuck. Bring your kids, pack a lunch. And don't forget to cheer. It's family fun with extra screams and blood confetti. Gallows outtakes, bloopers, blunders, and the occasional flying head. Let's be honest, as professional as medieval executions aspired to be, things absolutely went wrong. Frequently, public death was messy, chaotic, and, at times, accidentally hilarious. So before we dim the lights for the final bow, let's enjoy a little backstage chaos with our bonus chapter, The Greatest Misses in Execution History. The rope that couldn't end. A hanging in 1703 featured a rope that snapped not once, but twice. On the third try, the crowd just started chanting, "Let him go," because, frankly, they were tired, and the condemned had earned a weird kind of respect. He lived, was pardoned, and opened a very successful tavern named the Lucky Noose. The executioner who forgot his weapon. One fine morning, a very sleepy man in charge of beheading a minor noble arrived on the scaffold only to discover he'd forgotten his sword. The crowd waited an hour while someone ran back to fetch it. To entertain the mob, a juggler started improvising with onions and turnips. He got hired. The flaming misfire. During an especially dramatic witch burning in 1594, the fire starter misjudged the wind. The flames licked sideways and set a row of vendor stalls ablaze. Half the town's sausages were lost. The witch reportedly shouted, "See? I told you I wasn't the problem," as everyone ran screaming. The dramatic monologue that wouldn't end. A condemned playwright once insisted on delivering a full 5-act soliloquy before his hanging. He made it to Act 3 before the crowd booed him off the scaffold. The hangman muttered, "I've killed for less," then did exactly that. The dog who took the stage. At a hanging in rural France, a local stray dog bounded onto the scaffold, grabbed the rope in its teeth, and refused to let go. The crowd interpreted it as a sign from God. The condemned was spared, the dog became a folk hero, and people started tying sausages to their belts in hopes of summoning divine intervention. The accidental pardoning. One distracted royal scribe wrote the wrong name on a last-minute pardon. A thief was saved. A noble's second cousin was not. The king blamed poor penmanship and created a new law requiring all execution orders to be written very, very clearly, and not during lunchtime. The final words that backfired. "Go ahead, do your worst," the condemned shouted. The executioner, feeling personally challenged, performed a flamboyant sword flourish, decapitated the man in one swing, and got a standing ovation. The phrase, "Don't taunt the hangman," entered local wisdom. Executions might have been deadly serious business, but they were still performed by humans, with shaky hands, flammable cloaks, and stage fright. And when you mix fire, rope, horses, and thousands of spectators, something will go sideways. So next time you think your presentation went badly, remember, at least your head didn't bounce off a vendor's cart. Probably. Top 5. Execution reactions that changed history. Public executions weren't just performances. Sometimes the audience clapped too loud or threw their chairs. Reactions didn't always stay confined to gasps and murmurs. In a few spectacular cases, a single botched swing or rogue flame ignited something far bigger than fear. It sparked riots, revolts, and rewrites of the future. Here are 5 moments where the crowd didn't just watch the story, they changed the ending. 1. The Paris guillotine riot of 1792. It was supposed to be a tidy afternoon. 1 noble, 1 guillotine, 1 basket. But when a known aristocrat's severed head accidentally tumbled to the ground and rolled into the front row like a grotesque souvenir, something snapped. The crowd erupted, not in horror, but in laughter. They started tossing coins at the executioner, demanding encores and mocking the man's fall from power. Within minutes, songs were being improvised, and half the marketplace joined in a dance. Revolutionaries saw this as an insult to the cause. A fistfight broke out between a pro-guillotine faction and a group selling head-shaped pastries. By sundown, several were wounded, the executioner had fled, and a baker named Henry was declared enemy of the people for charging double for jam. The next day, the National Convention outlawed vendor stalls within 50 feet of the guillotine. The execution still happened, but it came with police presence and a no-snack zone. 2. The English Crown Collapse. Literally. In 1649, Charles I lost his head and his throne in one glorious velvet-draped execution. As the blade fell, the crowd exhaled, and then a stunned silence. No cheering, no shouting. Just the sound of England collectively realizing they'd just killed their monarch. The silence became murmurs. The murmurs turned to prayers. Then tears. Some ran home. Some just stood there, weeping into their gloves. A few shouted, "Long live someone?" That moment of quiet chaos marked a turning point in British history. Parliament panicked. Within months, new power struggles erupted. The republic that followed limped along awkwardly, like a headless chicken. Within a decade, the monarchy was back with Charles II. Lesson: cut off a king's head carefully. People might not cheer, they might just start a decade of confusion instead. 3. The Forgotten Princess and the Bread Riots. In Florence, a young noblewoman was scheduled to hang for treason. Her crime? Writing pamphlets criticizing the local duke's wine taxes. On execution day, as she stepped onto the platform, a local baker shouted, "She's right, though. The wine is terrible." Within seconds, dozens of townsfolk joined in. "Let her go," someone shouted. "Let her speak," someone else yelled. The guards hesitated. She began a passionate speech about dignity, taxes, and how stale bread was a crime against humanity. The crowd exploded. Bread was thrown. Windows were shattered. A nearby cart full of cabbages was looted in the name of justice. The Duke called off the execution and fled to his summer estate. The woman, pardoned. Later elected mayor. Execution reaction level, God tier. 4. The execution that sparked a war. In 1533, in a quiet part of the Holy Roman Empire, a minor noble was burned for heresy. The crowd included local farmers, minor lords, and the victim's very large, very loud brother. As the fire lit, the brother stormed the stage and tackled the presiding priest. Fistfights spread. Guards were overrun. The execution was halted mid-burn, but the moment was irreversible. Within weeks, local towns declared independence from the bishop's rule. It became a regional rebellion. That rebellion turned into a full-scale peasant war. Tens of thousands died, all because someone thought it would be fine to burn a woman named Annalise while her brother was still in the crowd. 5. The curious case of the applauding Pope. In 987 A.D., a papal execution in Rome was attended by high-ranking clergy, nobles, and an unusual number of goats for atmosphere. The condemned? A scribe accused of falsifying church records. When the executioner delivered a clean sword stroke, and the man's head hit the ground in perfect alignment with the altar steps, the Pope, perhaps out of habit, clapped. It echoed across the square. The clergy froze. Was this approval? Applause for precision? Divine endorsement? The confusion caused a theological argument that lasted 3 weeks. One monk claimed it was the first time a pope had ever reviewed an execution. Another claimed the clap meant the soul had ascended quickly. The pope refused to explain. As a result, the Vatican instituted a strict no applause rule for all future executions. and one cardinal developed a nervous cough that conveniently drowned out any blade-related thuds. Executions were meant to terrify, but sometimes they inspired, enraged, or confused entire nations. The crowd wasn't just a backdrop, it was a fuse. So next time you watch a story unfold in public, a trial, a scandal, a meme gone viral, ask yourself, are we watching justice, or are we writing the next revolution with our reactions? And whatever you do, don't clap. Final thoughts. Death with a View, why we watched and why we still do. So, what have we learned from our cheerful little stroll through the annals of execution history? That people are monsters? Maybe. That justice wears a mask and carries snacks? Certainly. But most of all, we've always loved a good show. Public execution was never just about punishment. It was about presence. The state making a statement, the town reaffirming its place, and the crowd validating its morals, through volume, pastries, and collective shivering. These weren't just deaths, they were events, and like all good events, they had tickets, opening acts, merchandise, and retellings. The condemned became characters. The crowd became chorus. The executioner. He was the director, the stage manager, and the special effects team rolled into one very grim fellow. Why did people go? Why bring their families? Why come back? Because executions gave people something in short supply, certainty. In a world where plague might take your child and tax collectors your goat, the scaffold offered closure. You knew who the villain was. You saw how the story ended. Yes, it was gruesome, sometimes botched, sometimes wildly unjust, but it was communal. People didn't just witness justice, they participated in it. They shouted, they wept, they clapped, they jeered. And afterward, they told the tale like they'd just seen the finale of the only show in town. It wasn't noble, it wasn't kind, but it was real, and it made people feel connected. Now? The gallows are gone, the fires are out, the swords rust, the scaffolds rotted. But we still watch, just with newer tools. We stream courtrooms, we binge true crime, we follow trials like serialized dramas, we comment, we share, we pick sides, we remember the names of the dead. We don't need blood in the streets anymore. But we still crave resolution. A clean ending. Justice we can see. Because history doesn't just repeat itself. Sometimes it just changes seats, and you're still in the audience.